You have to make those kind of decisions. And the question is, if one of the people, if those of us that are pastors, if somebody called and said, my son, and I've had this happen, my son is addicted. Not too long ago, my daughter's addicted. Can you help? And by then I knew the right people and I said, here, call these people and attempted to get her help. I'd like to tell you that's a success story. It's not. I buried her brother not long ago. Drugs. But I knew who to call. I'm not there yet in Venango County. I'm getting close. But see, that's what I can do. I can find out who are those people that can respond. We have to team up and do this as a team effort. We're gonna talk a lot about, there's my little scale. We're gonna talk about balance. We're gonna talk about need versus want. Why do we do something? We have certain needs and then we have wants, and we have to find a way to balance that. When you're thinking about this stuff, you need to think about the risk versus the reward. Why would somebody risk selling a human being? Because they can make $3,000 to $5,000 a night on a stable of girls. That's a lot of reward, isn't it? Especially when you feel pretty safe that you're not going to get caught. Supply versus demand. And here's where we tend to look at, I will tell you that the sex trafficking industry is driven by demand. But I'm going to challenge us to begin to think about why the demand is so high. Why are men paying for what they should be getting somewhere else? It's a vital question. And it's one that will make many of us uncomfortable to address. The game. For those of you that know me, I'm a huge baseball fan. And in the sex industry, it's when you get taken into the world of prostitution, it's called joining the game. And in a game, there's a playing field, right? There's a playing field. There are rules that we develop for that game. There's the people that play the game. There's the managers. There's the officials in baseball. They're umpires. There are vendors. There are people that sell and make business off of it. Let me tell you, the game of prostitution, or the life, has all of those. And there's also fans. We don't like to think about that part. But there are people that are making money over selling, even if you think it's free, somebody pays for it. Now, I love the game of baseball. I'll watch. I'm a Pirate fan. You have to love baseball to remain a Pirate fan, right? Come on. We haven't been to the World Series. We're the new Chicago Cubs. But I love baseball, and I'll watch baseball. I'll go to any level of game. But I want you to think about how the game of baseball started. It really started probably with four stones somewhere. They're called bases, and somebody created this game. But then we began to develop rules, and we put foul lines in to limit where we could play within that game. And then we put fences up. Do you know, early days of Major League, the Exposition Park on the north side of Pittsburgh, right about where PNC Park is today. If you're a Pirate fan, PNC Park sits just about where Exposition Park was built around the turn of the century. And the original field, if you look at pictures, there's no outfield fence. The fans stood out there. Well, as the game grew and people were encroaching on the field, they put fences up. They put fences up. They added to the rules. And then we did things. We put pitching rubber in so that you had to pitch from the same place. And then people tried to take advantage of that in many ways. So we put a circle around there that you had to stay. As a pitcher, you had to stay within that circle. And finally, we put umpires on the field. You may say, what's that got to do with trafficking? Well, many would say that trafficking is a game, and it's a complex one. If you're gonna work in a major league field, I don't know anybody in the Pittsburgh grounds crew for Bay Pirates, but we have a kid from Cambridge Springs that's graduated Cambridge Springs, now is on the grounds crew for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and almost every day on TikTok, he posts a video of how they mark out the field. It's complex. It's like this. A baseball diamond has all these rules that we've built in to baseball. And what makes baseball marketable? We build a love for the game. We meet a need. So let's go to the next step. Why are humans marketable? Why will somebody buy a human being? Because there are lots of vulnerable people out there. There are no production costs. They're easy to replace. There's always an easy replacement. High pay with a low cost of getting caught. High demand. And let's face it, the kind of money we're talking about, breaking the law is worth the risk. Some of us might get caught. We'll talk about why it's so hard to prosecute a terror. And the demand is high. Now, why is the demand high? Because we demand it. We want what they're selling. Whether we want to admit that or not, we want what they're selling. Now, how profitable is it? $150 billion a year in profits, 99 billion, we've seen this number before, from the sex traffic, the construction, though, all these other places that people are exploited, put into jobs and exploited. This is private sector. One of the things I'm not going to talk about today, I'm not going to talk about international trafficking, and I'm not going to talk about any place about government trafficking. All right, there's governments all over the world that traffic in people. We're not going to talk about that today. This is a breakdown in the United States of where they are, and you can see there is, oops. That wasn't what I wanted to do. There it is. Domestic work, restaurants, agriculture, beauty services, construction, manufacturing, hospitality, and others. Beauty services. Boy, one of the people we ought to be training to recognize human trafficking is those that work in our hair salons and things like that. And then there's a lot of people being trafficked into like nail salons. And you can get your nails done real pretty by somebody that maybe is sleeping with 9 other people in the same room that night. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where most of us are familiar with this, but what I wanted to point out is an interesting thing. Down here in the bottom is sex, reproduction. It's a basic need for humans to survive, and there's a high demand for it. But we're afraid to talk about healthy sex. We're afraid to talk about, the many things that make up a healthy sexual relationship. I remember one time I posted something sex-oriented on my Facebook page, and one of the members of my church said, "Never thought I'd hear my preacher talking about sex." When I work with couples, the two greatest struggles are sex and money. When I'm working with a couple preparing for marriage, I deal with this issues of sexuality and pornography. We'll talk about that yet more. But as you go up that hierarchy, that's where we want to be, is at the top. But we've got to meet the basic needs. And let's be aware that when we're not meeting basic needs, we're having trouble getting folks to move up the ladder. And there's all kinds of things in there. And what you'll notice here is that most of these physiological needs, most of us have them met there at home. But what if you're homeless? What is a home? What does it mean to have a home? It's a place to sleep. It's a place to rest. It's a place to eat. It's a place we come to get food. We take shelter most of the time. Our homes it's a place we come just to relax and rest. It's a place we come to have sex. Now, I have to admit, when all the other ones, now I looked at all my slides, that one was never on there until yesterday. But the reality is, that's where we've traditionally come back to have that need met. But the truth is, today, there are too many homeless. There are too many people out there that don't have a place to do that. We have a lot of people especially that have been trafficked or convicted of a crime, who go from home to home, live in their cars. And if you don't think it's happening, I served a church one time. One of the churches on a multi-point appointment was in a county seat. And it was full of doctors. The church had doctors and nurses and attorneys and all that in it. And one day I was talking about our mission to those that had a need and those that were homeless. And somebody said, "We don't have any homeless in our neighborhood." Oh, we had people sleeping in their cars, crashing on couches. You know what the interesting thing was? Not too long before somebody said that to me, the custodian found a homeless man dead, sleeping on the couch in the basement of the church. We don't have any homeless in our community. What is a homeless person? Vulnerable. Let's talk just briefly about immigration, because it's been in the news. Immigration is about, and we can't talk about immigration without talking about migrant workers. And this is a very vulnerable population, and it includes in our world. I'm not sure I realized until I began looking at this, and I began listening a little more carefully to the number of migrants that work through a community. That's what a migrant is. They're somebody that moves, usually looking for work, and they move through. And so I start listening, I start hearing about farmers telling me that a group was coming through to harvest their crops. One of my people from one of the churches I serve came in one day and was telling me, "Oh, I was driving back through Ohio and I stopped to see my friend, and he had about 40 guys out, and they were picking watermelons." They were migrant workers. Now, I don't know what their story was. I didn't. Do you know the difference between an immigrant E and I? One is when you refer to an immigrant with an E, you're talking about the country they came from. And when you're talking about with an I, it's the country they're coming to. But what are the things that impact migrant workers? You've got many of them are living without a home. They're looking for work continually. They have limited or no health care. They have oftentimes their legal documentation is taken from them. Now, what do all those things make them? Vulnerable, at risk for abuse. And then there's two other things that I wanted to mention. They lose friends, and they lose trust as they work in the migrant world. Again, just a brief description. But the truth is, we all have a responsibility to the vulnerable in our communities. We need to be aware of who's vulnerable and why. If you want one book that I recommend, it's this one, Vulnerable. I just happened to pick it up. I found it somewhere, and it said Vulnerable, Rethinking Human Trafficking. And it's an extensive look at who the vulnerable people are in our communities. And it's not just, you shouldn't read this book just because it talks about human trafficking. You should read this book because it will make you begin to rethink about who the vulnerable are in your community that then are at risk for human trafficking. So I just wanted to, I'm not going to read through these. I wanted to fire these slides up there and show you, this was a list I made as I worked through this material of who was vulnerable in our community. Who are the poor? Who are the disadvantaged youth? Who do we tend to see when we see our youth? We see the ones that are newspaper. Who makes newspapers? There are two groups of people make the newspaper. Me and everybody else. Well, I would say that the two, one is those that do really well. If you're an athlete or those that are in a lot of trouble. Not you. In the blotter. Elderly. Many of our elderly are vulnerable in ways we've never thought about. The disabled. And part of the problem is we think these folks could never be trafficked. Man, could you put some of these people to work and nobody would know it? How many of your neighbors do you not even know when they're there? Ask yourself this question. How many neighbors do you have that could die and lay for 3 days before anybody found them? That's a hard question to ask ourselves. The truth is, most of us probably have those neighbors. Because you know what we don't do anymore? We don't know our neighbors. You know, when I think back to growing up, the street I grew up, Wilson Drive, outside of Wampum mailing address. I grew up down there, and I can still tell you who lived in every house and probably about the year they built it. My parents built the second house on that road, and I could tell you who lived in there, but I couldn't tell you who lives in there today. And my brother lives on that road, building another house down the road, and I don't know that he could tell you. Because we don't talk to our neighbors like we used to. Single parents, you talk about a vulnerable group. We like to think they have all kinds of benefits, but boy, I'll tell you, they are oftentimes stressed and need of assistance. Prisoners. I want you to think, though, of prisoners in two ways. Something that in some other reading I was doing this year really came home to me that I hadn't thought about, which makes a prisoner, what happens to a prisoner when they get out of jail? Most prisoners get out of jail and they end up doing what? Parole and probation, right? Now they're out of jail, but they're struggling to have a job. They're struggling to make a living. And so they're vulnerable. And we have girls that have been convicted of drugs and alcohol convictions as a prostitute who are now vulnerable because they have a record. I had an interesting conversation not too long ago with a state trooper. I had to call in I'm a mandatory reporter for child abuse, and I had a convicted sex offender in my neighborhood, and somebody reported an interaction that happened several years ago. And so I called it in. Actually, I submitted the report online. Trooper calls me, goes to investigate it, said they don't really want to do anything about it. Okay. He said, I'm closing the case. And I was telling him that this family was giving me grief over this. And he said, oh man, he said, that's too bad because that guy actually is working. Do you know how many convicted sex offenders just don't want to work? Vulnerable. Sick. We're sick. Dealing with a situation right now. Man in his 50s has cancer. Can't work. Struggling to make it ends meet. Not living a lavish lifestyle, but vulnerable. Vulnerable to be used. Disaster survivors. I used to train for disaster response. I used to be one of our disaster response trainers. And boy, you talk about a group of vulnerable people, people that have experienced a natural disaster are very vulnerable. And boy, there's always somebody in there to take over for them. What an opportunity for somebody to traffic people. Immigrants, ethnic minorities, people that others look down on and make assumptions and judgments about them because of who they are. I wanted to just, I've been quoted a lot of Bible verses today, but this one, there's a phrase in this passage from James that just, as I read through the Bible and as I read through all of the stuff, whether I'm dealing with drugs or trafficking, the idea of widows and orphans. We have a responsibility to widows and orphans. Now let me tell you that a widow in first century, a widow was not what we think of. What is a widow today? We think of somebody whose husband has died, right? That they become a widow. But that wasn't true up until recent history. You weren't a widow until you had no one else to support you, including a new husband. Today, we've built other social networks underneath that. And orphans, here's what makes orphans vulnerable today. It's really the same thing as makes our widows vulnerable. We put them where they're unseen. You know, I've gone to Russia several times over the years, and I work in an orphanage. And I'm always fascinated because they'll say the same thing that I hear about our kids. They'll say they're not really, they're not an orphan because they don't have any parents. They're an orphan because nobody can care for them. What do we do with our kids that nobody wants or can care for? We send them into the foster care system. And I believe we send them in the foster care system most of the time because it allows us to make them vulnerable. And I can tell you it's a recipe for disaster most of the time when you take a trafficked young woman and put her in the foster care system. It's just, in my mind, it's when I know about the foster care system, I'm not criticizing the foster care system. I think that it's supply and demand. They have such a great demand, they can't handle it. But man, some people need more than an individual home can handle. So let's talk about who buys sex. Who is it that buys sex? I want to suggest to you that list is very long. It's something that anybody does. Now, some of you are going to say, "Oh, that's not true. It's not. We don't buy sex." Well, I'm going to argue with you. I want to argue that there is no flat definition of who buys sex. And we'll talk about what it means to buy sex in a minute. But, I go back to this hierarchy of needs, and I think it's messy. As we go up that, it's, down on the bottom is basically are the basic needs. And then as we go up, we kind of think of them as more and more optional, I think. But Maslow would say these are all needs, even going up in there to morality and creativity and acceptance and experience with a purpose, meaning and inner peace. That's what we all want. Now, the question is, what are we doing to help people move towards that? Now, I have a way that I've developed. I have all these other things that I do, and in developing a relationship, a workshop that I've done over the years, I developed what I call my TAR principles. So we have these needs, and I think the way we meet many of those needs is within relationship. So I've developed what I call my TAR principle, and it's an effort to bring the needs. And as we get higher up, I'm in my mind, we need them, but it's leaning towards wants. And so TAR stands, what do you think TAR stands for? And if you've heard it, you can't tell. What do you think? It's an acronym, I'll tell you that. Last letter is relationship. Here, I'll give you a hint. T plus A equals R equals relationship. What does the T and the A stand for? This is how we build a relationship with somebody. This will be the center of what I'm going to talk about next Tuesday night at church. Trust and acceptance. Boy, those are good ones. T plus A equals R. Time and attention. One without the other doesn't work. Because when we give people time and attention, and I want you to think about what a trafficker does. They invest time in learning about them, meeting their needs. Now, let's talk about, I use this when I'm talking about dating. And I talk about, when we're dating, what do? We put lots of time into a relationship, and we pay attention to the details. And then we come down here, we stand in front of the church, we take vows that we're going to make each other the most important part of our life, and we walk out the door and we say, let's see, now where can I put my time and my attention? And what happens is those people in those relationships become vulnerable. What about our kids? Who's giving them time and attention? Paying attention to the details. And if you want to work in recovery work, that's what I think what you'll hear from Cinnamon today is that one of the things she's asking for that I told her I couldn't give is time to do what? Give attention to kids that are vulnerable and need. Why is sex marketable? I'm amazed, but it's really pretty simple. The first thing we have to do is define sex. I was doing a dating seminar for young adults, people in senior high up through college level a few years ago. And I went in and I said, how many of you, and I had a few parents of the seniors standing in the back, I said, the title of my message today is Dating Towards Nakedness. And I heard two parents go, oh, the preacher's talking about getting naked in dating. And I said, how many of your parents have told you not to have sex before marriage? Now, almost all of them admitted that's what they were told. And I said, now what's sex? Because here's how we define sex. Let's be real. We define sex as intercourse. That's what we really want. And why? I was with a group of volleyball players several years ago when my daughter was playing. I was back in one of the areas where we serve food and stuff, and there's a group of the girls in the back, and somebody said something. One of the girls are talking, and they tend not to think about who's listening, and I'm always listening, And one said something about, I don't know why my mom's so, worried about where I am. And then one of the other ones said, it's pretty simple. She's worried you're going to get pregnant. And I kind of laughed. What she was worried about was that in that relationship, there'd be intercourse. So on that night, I said, now here, let me give you my definition of sex. This is sex. Anything that creates sexual arousal. And there was one young man sitting there, and he looked at me and he went out loud, all she has to do is walk in the room. And we all kind of laughed. But the reality is, that's true in some cases. So what does that mean? Walk into the room. What else is it? Well, there's all kinds of things that create. We work on this. If I do this program called Understanding Your Man, and I have all these images I flash up so that you see, without thinking about it, the men in your life are seeing these images day in, day out. And how many of them are involved with sexual things? I used to be in the auto parts business, and I was a buyer. I would go to Chicago, and that's where all the big buying shows. I would work these shows, and like 3/4 of the booths would have girls in bikinis and all kinds, and they would give posters out and all kinds of stuff. Some of them were famous models. What does that have to do with auto parts? It doesn't. It had to do with attracting men to where they are. And what were we buying when we bought for them? Sex.